Namaste and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Pavanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram. Om Shri Vivekanandari Sakshishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Jana. So we are presently in the midst of the chapter called The Festival at Panihati, and in the midst of the day of July 21st, 1883. And we are on near the lower middle of page 263 in the Gospel. And so Sri Ramakrishna had gone by carriage to Adhar Sen's house. And now he was about to go to Jaddu Malik's house, and so that's where we enter today. Let me see. Oh, yes, actually, it's not the lower middle; it's the upper third of the of page 263. Adhar served Sri Ramakrishna with fruits and sweets. The master left for Jaddu Malik's house. So last time we read about the events at Adhar's house. So now he goes to Jaddu Malik's. And Jaddu Malik was a long-time devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna entered the room in Jaddu's house where the Divine Mother was worshipped. He stood before the image, which had been decorated with flowers, garlands, and sandal paste, and which radiated a heavenly beauty and splendor. Lights were burning before the pedestal. A priest was seated before the image. The master asked one of his companions to offer a rupee in the shrine, according to the Hindu custom. So this was a regular image of the Divine Mother, not one for a special festival. This was not Durga Puja or some other special festival of the Divine Mother. But there was the household deity of Jaddu Malik who was being worshipped. But probably because Sri Ramakrishna was coming, there was a little more ceremony than usual. And just for those who are not brought up in India, it says the master asked one of his companions to offer a rupee in the shrine according to Hindu custom. So it's the custom in India, among the Hindus, that whenever you go to a shrine, you offer something. If it's just a small bill or something, but whenever you go to a shrine, you offer something. So that having gone into me, even if I go to a church or something, I offer even as a tourist when traveling in Spain or Iceland or wherever I'm traveling, and I go into a church or a temple, I always offer something, a token of offering to the deity and the maintenance of the deity of the place, whether that be a Hindu deity, Buddhist, Christian, whatever. Sri Ramakrishna stood a long time with folded hands before the blissful image, the devotees standing behind him. Gradually he went into samadhi, his body becoming motionless and his eyes fixed. So that, of course, we're very familiar with. Sri Ramakrishna, anything could send him into samadhi, and certainly a beautifully decorated image of the Divine Mother, which was being worshipped. He no doubt would have seen the living Divine Mother, not the stone image, but the living Divine Mother. We need to come up in English with another expression for folded hands. This isn't really folded hands. Folded hands is like this. And so Sri Ramakrishna, of course, wouldn't have stood this way. He would have stood like this in front of the image and went into samadhi, his body becoming motionless and his eyes fixed. With a long sigh, he came back to the world of the senses and said, still intoxicated with divine fervor, "Mother, goodbye." But he could not leave the place. He remained standing there. Addressing Ramlal, he said, "Please sing that song, then I shall be all right." So again, Sri Ramakrishna couldn't move. His mind was too high. He hadn't yet come back fully into the body so that he could operate in a normal sense. His mind was in another realm still. And of course, Ramlal, his nephew, all he said was, "Sing that song." So what does that song mean? Well, Ramlal knew, because Ramlal spent a lot of time serving Sri Ramakrishna. After Hriday had disappeared, after Hriday had been driven out of the Dakshineshwar Kali temple, after many years of serving Sri Ramakrishna, but then because of misbehavior, he was driven out by the management. Then Ramlal, in time, became the one who looked after Sri Ramakrishna, who accompanied him wherever he went. And of course, some of the young boy devotees also, of course, they were young men at that time. They also took care of him, but Ramlal had been with him for some years and knew his moods and knew what he needed. So Ramlal sang, "O Mother, consort of Shiva, thou hast deluded this world." And that's all of the song that it gives right here. I'm sure that the rest of the song is given elsewhere in the gospel, but Swami Nikhilananda, for songs that were sung several times through the gospel, he would sometimes just give the first line after it had already been given. So the master went to the drawing room with the devotees. Every now and then he said, "O Mother, please dwell in my heart." Jaddu was sitting in the drawing room with his friends. The master sat down, still in an ecstatic mood, and sang, "O Mother, ever blissful as thou art, do not deprive thy worthless child of bliss." So he said to the mother every now and then, "O Mother, please dwell in my heart," which is strange from our standpoint that Sri Ramakrishna would say that, because he always experienced the Divine Mother. But perhaps it was for instruction of others. Perhaps it was a way of instructing others. And perhaps it's just that even though he was fully aware of the Divine Mother all of the time, it was still a prayer that comes from the heart of a child. Because Sri Ramakrishna would be in different moods at different times. Sometimes he would be like a sage. Sometimes he would be like a little helpless child, an immature child. Sometimes he would be in a variety of different moods. So finishing the song, he said to Jaddu, still in a state of divine fervor, "Well, sir, what shall I sing? Shall I sing, 'Mother, I am thy 8-month child'?" And so then he began to sing that very song. This is a song of Ram Prasad, and as I said recently, the songs of Ram Prasad are wonderful, very playful. His songs to the Divine Mother, teasing the mother, pleading with the mother, but very much the playful songs of a child to its mother. Mother, am I thy 8 months child? That is, am I your premature child? The idea was that premature children, those who were born prematurely, tended to be weak and fearful. So, mother, am I thy 8 months child? Thy red eyes cannot frighten me. My riches are thy lotus feet, which Shiva holds upon his breast. Yet when I seek my heritage, I meet with excuses and delays. A deed of gift I hold in my heart, attested by thy husband Shiva. I shall sue thee if I must, and with a single point shall win. If thou dost oppose me, thou wilt learn what sort of mother's son I am. This bitterly contested suit between the mother and her son, what sport it is, says Ram Prasad. I shall not cease tormenting thee till thou thyself shalt yield the fight and take me in thy arms at last. So again, this wonderful sense of playful love with the Divine Mother, love which had no room for fear, no room for awe, but just the child who is fully confident of its mother's love, fully confident of its the protective mother and the all loving mother. Coming down nearly to a normal state, the master said, I shall take some of the Divine Mother's prasad. Then he ate a little of it. So again, that was Sri Ramakrishna's way of forcing his mind down to the plane where he could deal with others, he could deal with the devotees. He was always trying to hold his mind down to this plane so that he could be of service to the devotees. Our problem is to lift the mind. His problem was to keep his mind down low enough so that he could talk and interact with others. The natural tendency of his mind was always to plunge into samadhi. And so, as we know from many examples, that he would, when trying to bring his mind down, he would hold on to some small desire. Like sometimes it was just, I shall drink water. But by making what we call in Sanskrit a sankalpa, an intention that I shall drink water, he could bring his mind down to the transactional realm. Or sometimes he would say, as he says here, I shall eat a little prasad of the Divine Mother, or I shall take something to eat, or I will take the smoke of tobacco. And so something, creating a desire and an intention to do something to bring his mind back into this realm of transaction, Vyavaharika Satya. Jadu Malik was sitting near him with several friends, among whom were a few of his flatterers. Now, in all cultures, there are flatterers, of course, in all countries, in all cultures. But in traditional societies, it was even more common than you see it now. And so in societies that are still more traditional, you find even now that this tendency towards flattery is fairly strong, something that Sri Ramakrishna despised. And so that Jadu Malik was a very wealthy man, and so there were always people hanging about him, hoping to get some of the crumbs from his table. So the master with a smile, well, why do you keep these buffoons with you? So this and in what follows, Sri Ramakrishna's words are very strong. Sri Ramakrishna didn't mince words, and he was not what they say, he was not a respecter of persons. That is, he said whatever he had to say, whether it hurt or didn't hurt. But there's also a cultural difference here, which I often saw the contrast between American and especially American and British culture, because America, though there are people from all over the world now, it started as an Anglo colony, and so the British Isles had a outside influence on the culture of America, and still do. I mean, that still continues. Not that the influence is still coming, but the old influence that came at the beginning still works through the society. And so in British society, as in American society, uh, uh, there's a premium given to politeness. In England, even more than America, certainly, but in America also. So you don't say insulting things to people, and people who do say insulting things are not thought well of. They're thought of as somewhat unpleasant. But in India, it always surprised me that people were much more direct in saying things, and could say things that we would take as very insulting, then they could just say it as in the matter of course. So Sri Ramakrishna here is quite insulting to Jadu Malik and to the people that were around him. And some of that is more natural in the culture where people, in some ways, in certain situations, especially with a senior person, they can be more direct. A junior person is not direct with a senior person, but a senior person can be direct with a junior more than you find oftentimes here. But besides that, Sri Ramakrishna was one who was so devoted to truth that he didn't mince words. He didn't say things just to please people. So again, he asks him, with the Jadu Malik seated there and these flatterers seated around him, he says right in front of them, well, why do you keep these buffoons with you? Jadu, with a smile, suppose they are. Won't you redeem them? And so that was a good question from Jadul. Yes, what if they are buffoons? But you have come to have redeem humanity. So Sri Ramakrishna said, smiling, the water of the Ganges cannot purify a wine jar. And so, meaning that if even the water of the Ganges cannot purify a wine jar, there's some things that just can't be purified. And Jadu had promised the master that he would arrange a recital of the Chandi in his house. Some time had elapsed, but he had not yet kept his promise. So the Chandi, the Devi Mahatmyam, something that was this recitation of it is very sacred, is very auspicious. Some people say it every day, some people say part of it every day. Our Swami Tathagatanandaji, who used to be the head of the center in New York, he used to recite the Chandi every morning. So Jadu Malik had said that he was going to arrange a recital of the Chandi in his house some time back. So the master said, well, what about the recital of the Chandi? Jadu, I have been busy with many things. I haven't been able to arrange it. Master, how is that? A man gives his word and doesn't take it back. The words of a man are like the tusks of an elephant. They come out, but they do not go back. A man must be true to his word. What do you say? Jadu, with a smile, you are right. So here, that's a famous expression and a beautiful expression. That's one that we should internalize, that the tusks of an elephant, once they're out, they never go back. And so the words of a true person, a true man or woman, once they come out, they don't go back. Once you've said, I'm going to do this, then you move heaven and earth in order to get it done. So a man must be true to his word. What do you say, Jadu? You are right. Master, you are a shrewd man. You do a thing after much calculation. You are like a Brahmin who selects a cow that eats very little, supplies plenty of dung, and gives much milk. All laugh. So this sometimes Sri Ramakrishna would elaborate even more. He would say, you're like the Brahmin who wants a cow who eats very little, gives plenty of milk, plenty of cow dung, and never kicks. So sometimes that also was thrown in there. So that is the ideal cow. After a time, he said to Jadu, I now understand your nature. It is half warm and half cold. You are devoted to God and also to the world. The master and his devotees were served by Jaddu with sweets and fruit, and then the party left for the home of Kailat Ghosh. Kailat Ghosh's house was a big mansion, but it looked deserted. As the master entered the house, he fell into an ecstatic mood. Ramlal, and a few other devotees were with him. Their host was Kailat Ghosh's brother-in-law. He was an old man, a Vaishnava. His body was stamped with the name of God, according to the Vaishnava custom, and he carried in his hand a small bag containing his rosary. He had visited the master now and then at Dakshineshwar, but most of the Vaishnavas held narrow religious views. They criticized the Vedantists and the followers of the Shiva cult. Sri Ramakrishna soon began to speak. So his body was stamped with the name of God. That probably meant the tattoo that you sometimes see, especially among Vaishnavas, where they tattoo the name of God on their bodies, sometimes all over their face and arms and everywhere, but sometimes more moderately. And of course, it was also it is common, you see it among the Krishna consciousness devotees, to carry a bag, cloth bag, in which you keep your japamala, your rosary, and you put your hand inside of it and you tell your beads in that way. And so Vaishnavas tend to always carry this bag with their beads around, and in the midst of all of their activities, they're telling their beads. And so that is what Sri Ramakrishna is referring to. Master, it is not good to feel that one's own religion alone is true and all others are false. God is one only and not two. Different people call on him by different names, such as Allah, some as Allah, some as God, and others as Krishna, Shiva, and Brahman. It is like the water in a lake. Some drink it at one place and call it jol, others at another place and call it pani, and others at another third place and call it water. The Hindus call it jol, the Christians water, and the Muslims pani. But it is one and the same thing. Opinions are but paths. Each religion is only a path leading to God, as rivers come from different directions and ultimately become one in the one ocean. So here, of course, Sri Ramakrishna is speaking because of this, is speaking in these terms, which he often did, but on this occasion he's speaking in these terms because of the old man who was a Vaishnava, and obviously a devout Vaishnava because he had the name of God tattooed on himself. He had the tuft of hair, he had the japamala bag that he kept with him, telling his beads no matter what else he was doing. And so Sri Ramakrishna, knowing not just that many Vaishnavas tended to be very narrow in their religious views, but he could see the inner heart of people. So he undoubtedly knew that this man was of that nature, not just because of his dress, but because he saw into the man and saw that he was very narrow. So he begins these words about it's not good to feel that one's own religion alone is true and all others are false. So again, not all Vaishnavas. Vaishnavism is a beautiful tradition, a wonderful tradition, and a very strong tradition in India. But many of the Vaishnavas fall into the habit of fanaticism. And there are those who believe that Krishna is the only form of God, that Shiva and Ganesha and the Divine Mother, they are all just demigods. And at best, they are servants of Sri Krishna. But God is really Sri Krishna. And so if you want to attain to liberation, you have to worship Krishna. Now that's completely contrary to the whole flow of the Hindu tradition since ancient Vedic times. Completely contrary. And so that should not be taken as a mainstream Hindu view, even though it is held by many of this particular sect. but it's not at all the mainstream Hindu view. From the Vedas through the Gita to modern times, the mainstream tendency in Hinduism has been one of religious liberality. And that you can see everywhere in India. You see it in small villages, you see it up in the Himalayas and remote places. You see it, I've seen it myself, seen it everywhere in India, this wonderful religious liberality. And so this is an idea which is quite contrary to the mainstream view. And here Sri Ramakrishna gives that beautiful analogy, which he often would give, that in a tank of water in a village that is a natural tank, or tank that's been dug out, where it fills in with the groundwater and rainwater, where villagers use this water from the tank for their household purposes, for bathing, etc. So people would come and take a jug of water to take to their house. Some would come and say they're taking a jug full of jol, the Bengali word for water. Is also one of the Sanskrit words for water. And they would take it in one type of vessel. And then the Muslims might come to another landing on the same tank. And in a different type of vessel, they would take pani, meaning water also. And then Christians at another landing might come and in a different type of vessel take water. But it's all the same substance. And so it's one that most of us have heard many times from Sri Ramakrishna's sayings and the Vedanta writings of our tradition. But it's still a wonderful tradition, a wonderful example, that the water is the same, but the type of vessel and the name that you call it are different. And so some people call the supreme reality Allah, some call it God, some call it the Buddha nature, some call it Kali, Krishna, Shiva, etc. There are many different names for the ultimate reality of the universe. And the different pots, that's not given here, but Sri Ramakrishna sometimes would give that different types of pots that they put the water in. So that is the different the different types of traditions. There are different customs, there are different rituals, and so forth. So they have different names and different stories and different customs and explanations and so forth. But they're all pointing towards the unnameable truth. And so, again, a beautiful example that the water is the same, the substance is the same, but the name and the vessel which holds it may be different. One vessel called Christianity, another called Islam, another called Hinduism, another Buddhism, etc. He continues, the truth established in the Vedas, the Puranas, and the Tantras is but one Satchidananda. In the Vedas, it is called Brahman. In the Puranas, it is called Krishna, Rama, and so on. And in the Tantras, it is called Shiva. The one Satchidananda is called Brahman, Krishna, and Shiva. So it's one reality with different names. So the mainstream Hindu view is this, that there is one reality that appears in various forms to different devotees, according to our nature and according to our need. So again, the reality is the same. The devotees were silent. A Vaishnava devotee, sir, why should one think of God at all? Master, if a man really has that knowledge, then he is indeed liberated, though living in a body. So, of course, what does this mean? Sir, why should one think of God at all? That's strange coming from a Vaishnava. But Sri Ramakrishna understood what he meant and answered accordingly. That is, the Vaishnava was speaking from the standpoint that if God is everywhere, and God is everything, and everything happens according to God's will, then why should one try to think of God? That everything is God, God is everywhere, everything happens according to God's will. So what is the need to try to think of God? If I'm to think of God, God will make me think of him. And so Sri Ramakrishna again answers that if a man really has that knowledge that God is everywhere and does everything, if a man really has that knowledge, then he is indeed liberated, though living in a body. Such knowledge is liberation. Not all by any means believe in God. They simply talk. The worldly minded have heard from someone that God exists and that everything happens by his will, but it is not their inner belief. Do you know what a worldly man's idea of God is like? It is like the children swearing by God when they quarrel. They have heard the word while listening to their elderly aunts quarreling. So that's a very good example, and one that all of us can relate to, that children say so many things that they've just heard people in the house saying, their parents, their aunts. So here he gives the example of they've heard their aunts quarreling and using the name of God. And so they also swear by God, but not because they even know what it means. It's just because they've heard their aunt saying it. And so Sri Ramakrishna is saying that worldly people are like that. That they've heard of God, they've sort of assimilated the idea that God exists, but it has no force in their life. It's just something that they've heard. And so they may go through the forms of religious life, and that you see everywhere, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, everywhere you see this. That many people who are culturally brought up in a tradition, not all of them, not even the majority of them, really believe deeply and sincerely in what it is that their tradition teaches, but they just go through the forms because that's just what you do. That's the way that the forms that you guide your life by. So it's not a deeply held belief, but just we've heard it, and so we repeat it. Is it possible for all to comprehend God? God has created the good and the bad, the devoted and the impious, the faithful and the skeptical. The wonders that we see all exist in his creation. In one place, there is more manifestation of his power, in another, less. The sun's light is better reflected in water than by earth, and still better by a mirror. Again, there are different levels among the devotees of God: superior, mediocre, and inferior. All this has been described in the Gita. So yes, those of you who have been following the Gita class, we recently, in recent weeks, have dealt a lot with that, as we dealt with the gunas in chapters 14, 17, and now 18 that we're on in the Gita. He describes this very thing. So Sri Ramakrishna is saying that it's very difficult to comprehend God, that everything proceeds from God, the good and the bad, the pious and the impious, success and failure, everything comes out of the very being of God. But he says that God, though everywhere, is more manifest, more visible in some things than in others. And so he uses the analogy of the water reflects the sun much better than the earth. Yes, the earth, even cement, even a stone, even dirt, does reflect the sun. No, you can't see the image of the sun in it because it's a very poor reflector. But the very fact that we can see the dirt or see the cement or see the sun means that it's reflecting the light of the sun. So yes, everything is a reflector of the sun. But in dirt, stone, cement, we don't catch an image of the sun because the reflection is so poor. But in water, you can actually see the appearance of the sun. But then he says, even better than water is a mirror. And so, yes, if you can look directly at the reflection of the sun in water without it hurting your eyes. But if you do look directly at a direct reflection of the full sun in a mirror, then it actually hurts your eyes because of the clarity of the reflection. And so, in this world where everything is a manifestation of God, God is more visible in some of those things than in others. Uh, so the Vaishnava says, "True, sir, master." The inferior devotee says, "God exists, but he is very far off, up there in heaven." The mediocre devotee says, "God exists in all beings as life and consciousness." The superior devotee says, "It is God himself who has become everything. Whatever I see is only a form of God. It is he alone who has become Maya, the universe, and all living beings. Nothing exists but God." So again, he had mentioned in the previous paragraph the superior, mediocre, and inferior devotees of God. And so here he explains what that refers to. So the inferior devotee is one who thinks of God as far away. Yes, I believe there is a God. I offer worship. I sometimes pray, but I wonder if my prayer reaches God, and I wonder where God is, and so forth. But my feeling is that God is far from me, and even though I believe in God. So such a one is a devotee of God, but an inferior devotee. But the mediocre devotee of God, which is much better than the inferior, the mediocre devotee of God feels that God is existing in all beings as life and consciousness. So wherever you see life and consciousness, that God is manifested there. So you see the signs of God in different things. Wherever you see consciousness is the indication that God is present there. So it's bringing God closer from God, praying to God in heaven and thinking that God is far away from me in my humble life, in my difficult life. But yes, God is here, but still just indicated by the signs of consciousness in other living beings. But the superior devotee is one who sees that God has become everything, that God is manifest in everything, that everything is a form, is an appearance, is a manifestation of God. That there's nothing, as Swami Vivekananda says in one place in a lecture in America, he says that I have never seen anything but God, nor have you. That is, we've never in our lives seen anything but God. What a powerful statement. The problem is that we don't recognize it. Everything that we see is nothing but God, and yet we see everything but God. So that paradox that yes, everything is God, everything, and yet I see everything as not God. I see everything but God, whereas actually I'm seeing nothing but God. So that's why Swamiji says, and I often quote it from in the inspired talks, don't seek God, S-E-E-K, don't seek God, just see him. That is, learn to, with that faith that yes, God, and that faith built on understanding that everything is a manifestation of God, let me try to see God in everything. Vaishnava, does anyone ever attain that state of mind? That is, that state of mind where you see that there's nothing but God, everything is God. Master, one cannot attain it unless one has seen God, but there are signs that a man has had the vision of God. A man who has seen God sometimes behaves like a madman. He laughs, weeps, dances, and sings. Sometimes he behaves like a child 5 years old, guileless, generous without vanity, unattached to anything, not under the control of any of the gunas, always blissful. Sometimes he behaves like a ghoul. He doesn't differentiate between things pure and impure. He sees no difference between things clean and things unclean. And sometimes he is like an inert thing, staring vacantly. He cannot do any work. He cannot strive for anything. So these different ways that a realized soul might appear, that's mentioned by Shankaracharya also in the Viveka Chudamani, the different ways in which a fully illumined soul, a Jivan Mukta, may appear, sometimes as a Pandit, a wise, intelligent person, sophisticated in their understanding and knowledge and wisdom, sometimes like a small child, sometimes like a madman or a ghoul, sometimes like one who is inert. And you see, when you read the life of Sri Ramakrishna, an extensive life of Sri Ramakrishna, like the great master, now also called Sri Ramakrishna and his divine play, then you see how all of these types who came to Sri Ramakrishna. And so you see in the text of his full life what he's talking about. So then M, the narrator, says, was the master making a veiled reference to his own states of mind? So M is asking the rhetorical question, when he spoke about these different ways that a realized soul might appear, was he speaking about himself? Because Sri Ramakrishna would sometimes appear like an extraordinarily wise person. Sometimes he would be like a little child who doesn't know anything and has to ask his mother, the Divine Mother, for everything. And sometimes he would be like an inert thing. The one thing that Sri Ramakrishna rarely appeared as, and he had prayed to the Divine Mother not to be that way, was as a ghoul, as an actual madman. There was that incident where this madman, apparent madman, came to Dakshineshwar, and he had a dog that went with him, an old ratty street dog. And so when he would get food, he would sit with his arm around the dog and feed himself and the dog. They would both eat together. And he had all of the appearance of a madman. And so Sri Ramakrishna said to Hriday, his nephew, that you see that man, that's not ordinary madness. That's the madness of divine knowledge. He's a liberated, enlightened soul. And but then Sri Ramakrishna prayed to the Divine Mother, please don't make me like that. And so that type of thing we don't see in Sri Ramakrishna, though he passed through that during his sadhana period at times. But later, that particular manifestation by the Divine Mother's blessing, that was gone. So why did Sri Ramakrishna pray not to be like that? Because that also is the way that a fully illumined soul might live. And if we could live that way, that would be a blessed state. Such a one is not living a degenerate state, not living a miserable state that they're living like a mad person. No, they're living that way because they have gone beyond all relativity. They live in infinite knowledge, infinite bliss. And so all of the relative things don't matter to them. So purity, impurity, clean and unclean, none of that matters to them anymore. But Sri Ramakrishna, he came for the purpose of living with and teaching and inspiring and uplifting devotees, and through that, uplifting the world itself. And so to fulfill his mission, that was not a manifestation of illumination, which was appropriate to the fulfilling of his mission. And so he appeared in these other ways, sometimes as an inert thing, sometimes as a child, as a small child, sometimes as a wise person, etc., but not as a ghoul. Master to the Vaishnava devotee, the feeling of thee and thine is the outcome of knowledge. I and mine comes from ignorance. Knowledge makes one feel, O God, thou art the doer, and I am thy instrument. O God, to thee belongs all, body, mind, house, family, living beings, and the universe. All these are thine, nothing belongs to me. So what a wonderful state that would be, to actually feel, to experience that everything is thine, O God. Everything is thine, O Divine Mother. This body, everything is thine. Then we would be free from the burden of the universe. We would be free from all burden, because everything belongs to God. What is there for me to think about? What is there for me to be concerned about? What is there for me to worry about? So everything belongs to God. I mean, Swami Bhuteshanandaji, one of the great Swamis of our order, who was the president of the order, he would have been the 12th president of the order, I believe, and a great illumined soul. But there's a story when he was still vice president. Uh, he had some sort of illness that required an operation. And if he didn't have the operation, as far as I remember, the prognosis was that he would gradually die from whatever it was. But there's something that the doctor said, you have to have an operation for this. So he was not at Bellermut at that time. He contacted Bellermut and said, this is what the doctors say. But what do you say? This body belongs to you. So you decide whether it should undergo this operation or should not undergo the operation. And so the authorities, they immediately said, yes, you must have the surgery. But that was a sincere statement of his, that this body is not mine. This belongs to the order. And so here, of course, Sri Ramakrishna is talking about everything belonging to God. But this is a related sort of idea, that this body has been given to the order. It's not my concern anymore. Whether it lives or dies, that's not up to me. It belongs to you, the authorities of the order. So you decide what the fate of this is. If it lives, okay. If it dies, that's okay. It's a wonderful incident in the life of a great soul that many of you have seen, I'm sure. An ignorant person says, "Oh, God is there, very far off." A man of knowledge knows that God is right here, very near in the heart, that he has assumed all forms and dwells in all hearts as their inner controller. So that is knowledge, to know that God is right here within the heart. That's why this Brother Lawrence's practice of the presence of God is such a wonderful and powerful practice. That if we have any devotional tendencies, if devotion plays any part in our spiritual life, that is something that we should learn to incorporate. So when we pray, to think that God is right here and I'm speaking directly to God, even if it's just mentally, even if I'm not using my voice. I can use my voice when I'm on my own, when there are not other people around, or I can do it purely mentally. But to think that I'm speaking intimately, directly to God, not sending my prayer out and hoping that somehow it travels through vast time and space to the ear of God. No, but God is right here. And the feeling that God is right here, just as if you're in a dark room, like the other week when we had the deep freeze and many of us were without electricity for days. So if you were in the house with a relative, husband or wife, or your mother, father, whomever, and it's at night and the light is off, you can't see anything, but you know that you're, just to use the example of your mother, that your mother is there in the room and you're there in the room. So even though you don't see her, you know she's there, and so you talk to her just as if you could see her. And so in the same way, even though through this practice of the presence of God, when we pray to God, we begin to feel that, yes, I'm speaking to you, and I know that you are listening to me, and I'm having an intimate conversation, just as if I were in a dark room talking to my mother who's seated in a chair right next to me. I know that you are here, and I'm speaking to you. So this brings us to the end of the day, July 21st, 1883, and so we will stop here. And next time we will pick up on Sunday, July 22nd. That is the next day from what we just read. So let me give announcements, and then if there are any questions, because we have a good bit of time today, I will take questions if there be any. So for announcements, on Sunday, I will speak at the usual time on Shiva. I spoke last week on the historical background of Shiva, or the historical development of Shiva up through the Vedic period, bringing the story up to the classical period. But this Sunday, I will speak on Shiva as we know the deity Shiva now, who Shiva is, how he's worshipped, etc. The symbolism of Shiva and all of that. So this Sunday will be, you can consider it part 2 of the lecture on Shiva, but it will be a self-contained lecture. I won't go back over the historical development. And then this next week, this coming week, on Tuesday, we'll have the Bhagavad Gita class as usual at 7:30 in the evening, live streamed. And on Thursday, we will not have the gospel class because Thursday will be Shivaratri. And so in honor of Shivaratri, we'll skip the gospel class, but at night at 7:30, we will have the Shivaratri worship here. It will be broadcast only online. People won't be allowed to come to the temple for the Shivaratri, but it will be online at 7:30. And then the following Sunday, a week from this Sunday, that is, the 14th of March, middle of March, we will observe the birth anniversary of Sri Ramakrishna. This year, his Tithi Puja, that is his puja according to the Indian calendar, which moves with the phases of the moon, his birthday is on March 15th, Monday, but we will observe it on March 14th, Sunday, at 10:30 in the morning with the puja. And then at 12 o'clock will be the arati, and by 12:15, those who wish to come on that day, March 14th, from 12:15 till 1:30, people can come and offer flowers, receive some prasad, one family group at a time with proper social distancing. Only one family at a time will be allowed into the hall here to make their offering. So those are the announcements for now. Otherwise, except for next week, the cancellation of the gospel class on next Thursday, otherwise the classes will continue as usual. And other than the lecture on Sri Ramakrishna, the worship of Sri Ramakrishna, the puja of Sri Ramakrishna on the 14th, Sunday services will continue as usual. So any questions, Suranji? Yes. So the question is that what Sri Ramakrishna talks about, the reflection on the earth of the sun, better reflection in the water, and the best reflection in the mirror. Isn't that speaking about the purity of mind? So that's one thing it's speaking about, yes, yes. And in a way, that's the main thing he's speaking about. But I think he was speaking in a larger sense that God is more manifest in a holy person, a holy woman, a holy man, a person of saintly character. There you find that God is most manifest. And God is present even in the crudest of people, the lowest of morally and etc., the lowest people. God is manifest even there, but not as visible. God is more visible in the pure-hearted. So yes, it does come back to purity of mind, but it's in the context he's speaking about where you see God outside, that you see God more in one who is saintly than in one who is deeply ignorant and, say, a cruel and ignorant person. And God is more manifest in a temple where people have done worship and prayed and so forth than he is in a bar hall or something like that. So wherever there is purity of mind in a person or in a place where people of pure mind have gathered, there the manifestation of God is greater. So why is the video image shaking every second? I have no idea. I didn't know it was shaking. It's not shaking here in this image. Yes, it must be. It must be a problem with your internet connection or transmission, Shobhaji, because yeah, here Connie says that her transmission is good. So yeah, it must be a problem with your connection there, Shobhaji. So be in the presence of God every time is that what Sri Aurobindo means with get the divine state here in this life? Well, that difficult to say because Sri Aurobindo he had his own philosophy of bringing the reality of God down into material creation, and so that was a somewhat different idea. This idea is more seeing the actuality of God already in everything. I've studied some of Sri Aurobindo. I'm certainly not by any means an expert in Sri Aurobindo's thought, but Sri Aurobindo's idea was somewhat different. He had the idea of bringing God into material creation. But from a Vedantic standpoint, there's no question of bringing God, manifesting God in material creation. Everything here is God already. It's just that we see it wrongly. So instead of bringing God into the world as if God weren't here already, it's a question of learning to see that this is all God already. So there's some difference there between Sri Aurobindo's view, which was a later view of his. In his early thought, you don't see that so much, but it was as his thought developed, he came to this idea of manifesting the supermind and all of that. So Sri Ramakrishna many times refuses to acknowledge himself as God or an avatara. Is there any parallel with other avatars also in their refusing to acknowledge their divinity? Now that I don't know of any other parallels like that, but Sri Ramakrishna didn't usually refuse to acknowledge his divinity. He refused to acknowledge that he was anything special. He would always say that I'm the dust of the devotee's feet. And so I assume that that's what you mean, Anantaraman, that Sri Ramakrishna would. As Girish Ghosh said, Sri Ramakrishna conquered the world through his humility. And so Girish Ghosh, when he first came to Sri Ramakrishna, I don't know if it was the first meeting, probably not, but one of his early meetings with Sri Ramakrishna, he just saluted him like this, like you might salute a buddy or an equal or somebody that in an office or something. You just saluted like this. So Sri Ramakrishna bowed his head and saluted him. And so then Girish, he bowed down like that, recognizing that, oh, if he's going to salute me like that, I should salute him. And then Ramakrishna went lower, and Girish went lower, and Ramakrishna went still lower, and Girish bowed down still lower until Ramakrishna got on the floor. And then Girish got on the floor. And so in that way, Girish said that Sri Ramakrishna defeated me through his humility. So Sri Ramakrishna didn't broadcast his divinity except among his inner circle, where he knew that it was important for them to understand who he was. But the main way that he didn't really out and out deny his being an avatara, he just didn't advertise it, and then he would always act as a very humble person and keep, yes. Yes, he would often say, and we see in the gospel, many times he would say, "What do you think of this?" And in the reminiscences of his disciples, he would sometimes ask them, "What do you think of this?" meaning of himself. And so that was his testing to see their own understanding, because he knew that those who were part of his inner circle, he didn't do that to other people, but those that were to form part of his inner circle, that he wanted to gauge their understanding. Were they coming to understand who he was and what their relationship to him was? Because he saw that that was important to the accomplishment of his whole mission on earth, his whole reason for incarnation, the whole reason for which he took birth and all of the trouble of taking human birth. It was to bring these associates who could continue his work and establish his work on a firm footing. But that depended on their understanding who he was and what their relationship to him was. Why was Swamiji's Ishtam Buddha when he had such a highly realized guru? So there's no evidence that Swamiji Ishtam was Buddha. Swamiji had great regard for Buddha, and he used to say that I have more love for that character than for any other. But that, if we read that in the context of the whole of Swamiji's life, we know that he was not talking about Sri Ramakrishna. He was talking about he loved the Buddha, regarded the Buddha more than any other person. And Sri Ramakrishna he regarded as higher than that. Sri Krishna, he says in one place, Sri Krishna was greater than the Buddha. So he had great regard for Buddha, but Buddha wasn't his Ishta. But there is evidence that Swamiji himself had been the Buddha in a previous incarnation. In fact, once his attendant, the attendant of Swami Shivananda, Mahapurush Maharaj, this was Swami Apurvananda. Swami Apurvananda came into Swami Shivananda's room in the morning as his attendant to take care of him. And so he saw that Swami Shivananda, the tears were pouring down his face. And he asked him, Maharaj, what is the matter? And so Mahapurush Maharaj says, last night Swamiji, meaning Swami Vivekananda, came to me and asked Tarak, the name by which Swami Shivananda was known to Swamiji, Tarak, do you not remember when I was Buddha and you were my Ananda? And there are many other indications that Swamiji was the same as the Buddha in a previous incarnation. So Swamiji loving the Buddha as an ideal person, a human being, but that wasn't putting him above Sri Ramakrishna, nor was it an indication that Buddha was Swamiji's chosen ideal. And does seeing God also depend on our purity of mind? Those who are pure can see him irrespective of the reflector's cleanliness. So yes, if to the degree that our mind becomes pure, to that degree we'll be able to see God inside and out. And then if the mind is pure enough, then we see God even in the murderer, even in the criminal, even in the lowest of people and in the dirtiest of things. We see God everywhere. So yes, that depends on purity of our mind. But for a more ordinary, spiritually elevated mind, not to that extent, but for an ordinary spiritual mind, we see according to the ability of the object to manifest God. So yes, it's a good question, because the fully illumined person, that doesn't matter. Then you see that everything is God. There's no question. As that madman that came to Dakshineshwar, who was a fully illumined soul that I referred to earlier today, that Sri Ramakrishna said, this is not an ordinary madness. This is the madness of the realization of God. Hriday, Ramakrishna's nephew, hearing that, chased after the man, and the man ran away and threw things at Hriday to get him away from him. And then finally, the Hriday wouldn't relent, and so the man stopped and said, when you see no difference between the Ganges and the water in the gutter, and the water in the gutter in India meant where people relieve themselves, go to the bathroom in the gutter and everything. So it's not just rainwater which is draining, but it's filthy water. So when you see no difference between the water of the Ganges and the water of the gutter, then you will have attained to Brahman. And so he had that purity of mind where he saw no difference at all. So whether eating with a dog or eating on a gold plate, it made no difference to him. Everything was the same. So yes, that is true. But for an ordinary person, we go to holy people and we go to holy places because we see a better reflection there. So both are true. So, okay, that's all of the questions for today. Good questions. So let me give a closing prayer. ॐ निरञ्जनं नित्यम् अनन्तरूपं भक्तानुकम्पाधृतविग्रहं वै ईशावतारं परमेशमीड्यं तं रामकृष्णं शिरसा नमामः। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। हरिः ॐ तत्सत्।